Is the Department of Housing and Urban Development about to double down on the 2015 federal takeover of local zoning regulations? Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about HUD and a 2015 regulation that you may or may not be aware of. It was called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And what it did was it was submitted by the Obama administration. It was finalized in 2015. And what it did was require recipients of $3.3 billion of annual community development block grants to rezone local municipalities along income and racial guidelines. And what they would do is they take census tracts and say you're applying for community development block grants. This is funds that are used to build housing in urban and suburban areas and rural. And they were saying, well, we're going to look at your census tracts and we're going to see kind of arbitrarily, in my opinion, what they consider to be fair housing based upon income, based upon race, and other considerations that I don't believe really take into account market conditions for why some neighborhoods are nicer to live in than others. There's a lot of factors, economics, demographics that play into that. And the Fair Housing Act, it does prohibit housing discrimination. So you can't refuse to buy, sell, or rent based upon race as a consideration. So you can't refuse to sell or rent to somebody, but just because of their racial background and other considerations. And I think that was fine. But now what the Obama administration was suggesting it was going to do was go ahead and actually do it, make these considerations and say we're going to rezone your county or your city. So more than 1,200 of counties and cities take these community development block grants, and it covers the entire. We're talking about the entire country. This covers tens of millions of people. And big cities, they kind of depend on these development block grants. So the fact is that HUD would be able to go in and say, well, we're going to condition those funds, which you need to balance your budget on the zoning considerations that we would like you to consider. And so Americans for Limited Government, we opposed this when it was issued. Conservatives in Congress rallied against it. And eventually it was actually defunded by Congress. In the most recent omnibus bill that passed, it says none of the funds made available by this act. This is section 232. Let me give you the section number because it's important. Division F, Title 2 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, section 232. So this is the law right now. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by HUD to direct a grantee to undertake specific changes to existing zoning laws as a part of carrying out the final rule entitled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, and then the assessment tool that came along with that. So this is illegal. When it actually came up for a roll call vote in 2016, it passed 87-9. So Republicans, Democrats overwhelmingly opposed on a bipartisan basis the federal government coming in and dictating local zoning as a condition for receiving federal funds under the Community Development Block Grant Program. It's illegal. But that's not stopping Housing and Urban Development from revising the regulation. We were hoping that would mean they would rescind it or significantly alter it such that it wouldn't invoke zoning requirements any longer. But HUD Secretary Ben Carson, in an August 13th interview with the Wall Street Journal, was talking in 2018, August 13, 2018, said that he was going to make changes, but, quote, I would like to incentivize people who really would like to get a nice, juicy government grant to look at their zoning codes. Well, that's exactly what the prior rule did. That's what Congress has prohibited. Now, sources familiar with the final regulation being considered by the White House Office of Management and Budget suggest that it will still condition funds on making changes to local zoning, just with a different rationale to reduce regulatory burdens that contribute to higher housing costs, particularly in urban areas such as San Francisco. So, I mean, that's a laudable goal. I think on a local level, people should try to change their local zoning if it's, preventing, or if property values are growing too high, there's not enough housing stock, that sort of thing. And in the meantime, there's a lot of economic opportunities. So people shouldn't have to travel 100 miles just to get to work. But states and municipalities should be the ones to make that decision, not the federal government. And unfortunately, that's what's going on here if they go ahead and just reissue the regulation just with a different rationale. I can tell you from personal experience that when I went to HUD in Chicago in 2018, I was invited to participate in a roundtable discussion about this. And met with local zoning commissioners. And I said, you know what? We don't support changing this regulation just to change the rationale. We don't support it to try to create utopian municipalities along income and racial guidelines. We don't support federal intervention to try to decrease the cost of housing by changing these zoning regulations. And if you're a local zoning commissioner, you should probably not want the federal government to be intervening here, because eventually they're going to come in and tell you to change your zoning along guidelines that you don't agree with. So maybe under the Obama administration, people supported HUD coming in and doing AFFH, and maybe they won't like it when the Trump administration comes in. Point is that local municipalities should be making these decisions for themselves. Congress overwhelmingly agrees, 87-9. You don't get votes like that unless people are taking it personally and they're getting feedback from their local constituents, and regardless if it's a Republican area or Democratic area, that they don't like this sort of federal overreach. So we are where we are. I think that OMB should be looking very carefully at this regulation. They shouldn't be looking to defy federal statute. I think the law is very clear that HUD can't do anything with zoning on this regulation. They can't condition community development block grants on making changes to local zoning, and yet that sounds like what Ben Carson and HUD are up to right now. Sad to say, I mean, we support the Trump administration on many issues, but if it's the direction they're going to go in, we're not going to support these changes. If we're talking about mandatory changes to zoning regulations that the federal government's going to impose. I did comments, I submitted comments to HUD on this regulation last year, and we want to, I offered alternatives for ways to affirmatively further fair housing under their the HUD's mission. They're required to affirmatively further fair housing. Well, here's an idea. There's about 1.1 million households living in public housing units. Why don't we privatize those, and you could transfer title of the units to the tenants, the people who live there. That's what the Soviet Union, when it was falling apart, did. And satellites, places like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. There was privatization of housing. In the Soviet system, all housing was basically public. It was state-owned, and so they wanted to create a private housing market in these former Soviet republics and satellites. And the way they did that was by turning over ownership directly to the people who were living in them. And I think we could do the same thing with public housing. It worked out in the 1980s. You instantly had a market for housing. People who had the title, they themselves could either sell the property or rent it out. And it really enabled, I think, the economies to flourish in the Eastern Bloc in the post-Soviet era. And so by transferring housing directly to tenants, they would become the direct beneficiaries of billions of dollars of prime urban real estate, with the plan generating new income to jumpstart the redevelopment of urban centers where public housing is very prevalent. I think that, yeah, we could you could revitalize places like Queens in New York or Chicago, where there's lots of public housing, et cetera, in big cities, just by turning over the title of the properties to the people who live in them. I mean, if it worked in the post-Soviet era when the Soviet Union was falling apart, let's privatize public housing. There's one idea. Another idea, HUD might consider transferring properties owned by government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Federal Housing Administration, obtained via foreclosures. This happens. People have a government-backed loan, and then they default on it, and so the bank's going to repossess it. And ultimately, these properties wind up in the possession of the federal government via these GSEs. Maybe they should look, and you could be talking about hundreds of thousands of properties, but depending what's going on in the housing market, maybe the GSE should look at turning over control over at least some of these properties. I mean, do it on a trial basis, see what works, over to local housing authorities to combat the homelessness crisis and for other fair housing needs. I think that there's a lot of public housing stock, whether we're talking about public housing, the way we traditional public housing, or what's going on in with the GSEs when they take possession of properties. And I think that by privatization of housing stock and apartments, et cetera, we could revitalize neighborhoods, and we could really affirmatively further fair housing by making it more affordable and by giving title to people. I mean, what's better, living in public housing and you're merely a tenant, or being an owner of property? I think it's a pretty easy choice there, and that was the comment I submitted to HUD. I wanted them to think outside the box and look at different solutions to affirmatively further fair housing that wouldn't require them to come in and look at all the census blocks and say, oh, well, this is not fair. There's too many poor people living here, and there's too many rich people living there. You're going to have to make changes. You're going to have to move people around, or those single family dwellings, those are going to be high-rise apartments now. I don't like that. And we opposed the Kelo decision by Supreme Court that allowed for the government to come in and declare public use just so they could turn over smaller properties to developers to build high-rise apartments and other or commercial properties. We thought that was terrible. And so in the same vein, the government should not be coming in and saying and redrawing cities and saying that they're wrong. It's not going to affect the economics, frankly. People move around. So even if the government comes in into your neighborhood and says, well, this is going to be a different kind of zoning now, well, you could sell your property. You can move somewhere else. You could stop renting there. People kind of vote with their feet, and people move around all the time anyway because they get new jobs and they move to different towns and locales. So there's always a constant need to have new property. So people, whatever they do to rezone neighborhoods along income or racial guidelines, people are ultimately going to move around. Then it might undermine all the hard work that they're doing. And I think there's better solutions. We should be looking towards privatization of public housing. And I'll leave you with the close here. I don't think this is that controversial insofar as the Senate, members of both political parties are overwhelmingly opposed to the federal government getting involved with zoning. HUD under Secretary Ben Carson, he's doing a good job. And as far as we can see, they're trying to make it so that, for example, that housing, public housing, would only be available to American citizens under federal statute. So they're going to enforce that. There shouldn't be homeless veterans living on the streets, and illegal aliens living in public housing when that's illegal. So I think there's areas where Secretary Carson's doing a great job, and we're hoping that OMB, what we're hearing, that what the regulation that's being considered, maybe I hope we're wrong. I hope that whatever changes they're making to the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation are going to be it's not going to have mandates, not going to require changes to local zoning. And so I'll leave you with the close here. All of these solutions, we talked about privatizing public housing, could help HUD fulfill its obligations under the Fair Housing Act without obliterating local governance and the decisions made about zoning. Fortunately, there is still time for OMB to engage in a course correction before the government overreach that began with the regulation in 2015 becomes cemented. Leaving the affirmatively furthering fair housing rezoning regulation in place would be a big mistake for the Trump administration, and is one the nation will eventually come to regret. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a great day.